Ooh, look who's with us. Great. Hello everyone. Good morning and good afternoon or good night, depending on which time zone you're zooming in from. So this is a track called Health and Wellbeing, and I'm Louise, and I will try to moderate and chair the session. We have 3 papers in the session. All around health and well-being, and we have the first authors here to present with us. And yeah, so I think we should just get going. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. The session is 1 hour, and I would we have tested the software with people, so I hope it will work well today. If you have a webcam, camera on your computer, please turn it on if possible. It's nice to see some faces. We will have the presentation first, and then afterwards the chat will be enabled, so you can write your questions in the chat. But please keep your questions throughout the presentation and be ready to ask them after the presentation. Great. So the first paper we will start with is by April Turk and co-authors. It's called Restorative Play, Video Games Improve Player Wellbeing After a Need-Frustrating Event. So April, when you're ready, please share your screen and give us your presentation.
Hi, I'm April Turk, and I'm going to present Restorative Play, Video Games Improve Player Wellbeing After a Need-Frustrating Event. I wrote this paper while I was still at QUT, but now I'm a postdoc at Aalto University. So, many people play video games to feel better after negative events, to experience a kind of restoration. Coming home to work after a long and stressful day, for example, lots of people will play a video game. And research suggests that these attempts to feel better are often successful, and video games are actually very good at doing this. In HCI, studies of play and well-being tend to focus on positive outcomes, like positive affect. It's less common for us to look at negative outcomes. So in this study, we asked, to what extent do video games improve well-being by acting on negative outcomes? To what extent do they kind of attenuate these kind of negative moods or whatever? So to do this, based the research in self-determination theory, which is super useful for work in this area. It has a lot of theoretical propositions that help guide the work. And particularly like these concepts of need satisfaction and frustration, where a lot of research, as I kind of said previously, a lot of research focuses on how on these positive outcomes. And there's a whole bunch of literature to show that need satisfaction can predict positive outcomes. And you can find a summary of that literature in the paper. But there's less research showing that need frustration, experiences of incompetence, feeling controlled or socially rejected, for example, can influence negative outcomes. And this is established in other domains. It's a pretty new area of work. But it's not really been shown for video game play, at least not in a lab study, and not in a pre-post design, because, again, measures don't really support that kind of thing unless you do some weird study design. Measuring need frustration for games specifically remains a problem. We don't have game-specific measures, so in this study, I was forced to rely on a general measure, which well, I guess we'll see how it goes, but some items are clearly unsuited in hindsight to games. And then this is kind of an aside, but the choice of outcome measures is also limited. In this study, we used negative affect, and that was it. And if anyone has suggestions for like measures that actually like would apply in games, I'd love to hear them, because I'm still not really sure what negative outcomes I should be looking at. or what could be relevant. Anyway, in the study, there was a competence manipulation task, and before participants played Mark of the Ninja, which was assumed to satisfy competence, and indeed it did. But before that, they did this word-finding task, which manipulated competence in one of two conditions. The task introduction emphasized effort or luck. They were given positive or negative performance feedback after the first puzzle. They did two. And then they were scored, and I basically told them that they performed well above or below the average, where the average was made up. So this was a very unpleasant manipulation to run, by the way. I don't recommend it. But it was very successful. And this was Mark of the Ninja, the game that we used for the study. There were lots of reasons I picked it, and you can read all about them in the paper. But in brief, it has a lot of visual and audio kind of cues that help guide the player. It has a really good tutorial that's actually fun, even if you've played the game before. Yeah, so it had everything I really needed. And there's no real death penalty. You just get restarted back to the scene. So you're not really... So the manipulation was successful, as I said. We also unintentionally manipulated autonomy, though the participants improved more every time, on every measure, basically. So that was fully supported. Also expected need, satisfaction, and frustration to predict positive and negative well-being outcomes. Support for this was less clear. Competence was largely significant, and the adding competence and autonomy to the model was always significant. And indeed, we predicted a reasonable amount of model variance in each case. But autonomy was only a significant predictor for positive affect, which was kind of disappointing. But it may just be a result of low sample size. I did not run a power analysis before I did the study. And then I also interviewed participants after the study to understand how they experience need, satisfaction, and frustration in video games. And specifically, I was talking about Mark of the Ninja, though they were free to refer to any video game that they could think of. So the first theme was habitualization, which basically refers to players internalizing the rules, controls, and game mechanics, basically learning to play to some extent, or getting a feel for how to operate the game. These participants were often less experienced, or even just less experienced with video games generally, or even just 2D platformers or stealth games, or even, I think at least in one case, the Xbox 360 controller. I had at least one person tell me that they only had used a PS4 controller, and I didn't think they were remarkably different, but that shows my own biases, I guess. For these players, failure was generally conceptualized as not understanding what was expected of them, and conversely, I guess, success was just progress. If they succeeded, it was because they got through some part of the game. So in this quote, I think having the base commands on the screen was useful, especially for a game I haven't played before. It made it a lot easier. Also, when the game would sort of pop up, grappling hook would be useful here. That helped. So you can see it's what's more of a focus to these players is just understanding how to use all of these different elements. I think it's also relevant to note that the prompt that's being talked about here only shows up if you do nothing or fail to progress for a certain amount of time. So I didn't know that was in the game, but I think it reflects a broader kind of design mentality in Mark of the Ninja. Theme 2 is aligning with design intent, aiming to play in ways that designers intended or perceived to, at least, to realize the intended experience. And these were generally more literate players who had already grasped the fundamentals. They didn't need the tutorial, really. And for these players, failure was more about not living up to their own expectations or the expectations inherent to the character or the scenario. So in this quote, it's more about failing at their own code of trying to be this perfect ninja, if only because they were seen. So it's failure is less about, I'm running out of time, so I guess I'll go to conclusions. So basically, we found strong evidence that need frustration also contributes to restoration, but measures are an issue. For skilled players, competence isn't a foregone conclusion. They just experience it in different ways. They make their own game inside the game, almost. And this is kind of saying the same thing in a different way. The ways that people experience competence is a function of their own literacies. And accommodating all these people might be difficult, but Mark of the Ninja has some design elements that provide kind of opportunities to investigate that further, I think. Anyway, that's it. Thanks very much.
Let's give a round of applause. Thank you so much for the presentation, April. So now we will open the chat for your questions. So I would like you to type in either just your name or type in your question in the chat bar, and then I will monitor the chat and have you ask the question to the presenter. Great. So let me start with one question before you can all jump in. So thank you for the presentation. I thought that was really fascinating to hear more about what kind of impact that the plays and games can have on these negative experiences people have. So one of the first question I have is relating to the choice of this game, Mark the Ninja. I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about why you chose this game and how you think that has had an impact on this results you got. Because I haven't tried this game myself, but I know that there's a lot of difference between if a game has a lot of like logics in it or narratives, or if it has a plot, the kind of character that's in it. So what do you think the choice of this game had on your outcomes?
Great. Yeah, great question. And an issue that is kind of close to my heart. The game like features very minimal like narrative, at least like at the start of the game. There's an optional cutscene, and you know, players were free to skip it or watch it as they preferred. But mostly, I think what stands out in Mark of the Ninja is the way the tutorial is both like very well structured and like teaches you everything you need to know about the game, regardless of your skill level, while also not really getting in the way of people who don't need it. So it's still enjoyable and like provides opportunities, like more opportunities to demonstrate skill if you've played the game before or if you know more about how everything works. And there's still moments where you can pull off some, I guess, skillful moves, I guess, in the game, even in the first level. And beyond that, I think a lot of it is just like the visual and auditory feedback that it provides, which is really exceptional. There's no other games really that I'm aware of that have the same kind of prompts, I guess, like So above like guards' heads, you'll see icons that tell you about like what kind of state they're in. There's like enemy sight cones. There's audio indicators for your own movement, so you can see how far your own noise is traveling, and whether it will alert guards. And if you like walk up to a door but don't go through it, you can kind of peek through and see what's in the next room. There's a whole bunch of like little things that just kind of come together to support competence, basically, which was the main thing I was after.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have one question in the chat from Darius. Will you please ask your question yourself?
Sure. Thanks, April, for the talk. I'm curious, how long were they actually playing in your study, in your control environment, first of all? Yeah.
That was a half-hour session.
Okay, and these changes you reported were actually was for a half an hour time.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and do you expect, like, in the sense of well-being and these things, that is a thing that they need to play, or is it something just a short-term boost actually, or?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's a fair question. The answer is, well, from my study, it's not possible to tell, but there's other research in the area that does suggest that there are cumulative effects of video gameplay. And the reason I went for a longer session, 30 minutes is kind of on the longer end for this field, was mostly just because it's a session that broadly matches the kinds of play lengths that people generally do in real life. And I'm not sure whether playing for 10 minutes is really indicative of the ways that people actually usually play video games. How long the effect lasts is another question. I wish I knew. But I do think that's something that we need to consider as a field, I guess, or as a field, as like games / well-being / player experience researchers, I guess. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Cheers.
I have just one more question, unless someone, so I had a short peek at the paper and I saw, I was wondering if you could tell a little bit about the participants you had and the recruitment of that, and yeah.
Right, so it was mostly a convenient sample of undergrad students, though I did recruit pretty much anyone that I could find who would agree to sign up. There were some master's and PhD students in there as well, where I could find them. But mostly I asked people, I went into classes and recruited there, but I also like asked people just directly in person. And for my next study, that actually became more prominent. Basically everyone I ever had a conversation with, I would ask, well, do you have an hour of your time to like help me out with the study? I find directly asking people to participate is the most success I've ever had for recruitment.
Great. Thank you so much for your answers and for your presentation. Let's give another round of applause.
Thank you.
Great. So next up we have Darius Adam Rohani, who's presenting their paper called MOPS, a personalized recommender system for behavioral activation and mental health. And please present when you're ready.
It involves the development and testing of a standalone mobile app for people with depression. And I would like to motivate in the first couple of slides why this work is important, and then how we approach to solve this. And lastly, the results from our interviews with patients who use this app. So first, depression. It is the leading cause worldwide of disease burden, both on a societal level with loss of work days, but also on a more personal level, where you start to cancel your appointment with friends, simply lose the energy for trivial tasks such as cooking. The thing is that actually 1 out of 5 will experience a depressive episode, which make this disorder most likely to have influenced all of us, either directly or indirectly. So these patients are mostly treated with medicine. It is easily acquired, but it's associated with severe side effects. And alternatively, or in combination, you can be enrolled in psychotherapy with a therapist. There's no side effects with that, but and it's proven just as effective a medicine, but it requires trained clinical staff, and it's very time consuming. It has a high cost for the clinic, but more severely, it has low accessibility, particularly in rural areas. And I've underlined accessibility here because in our current situation with the corona outbreak, which makes actually one-to-one meetings with the staff even more difficult. One particular subtype of therapy called behavioral activation has proven very effective. It is in behavioral activation, the patient together with the therapist, they plan and schedule concrete doable activities that will drive the patient towards more, back to life with positive role running behavior. And they basically make such a plan on a paper, and the patient is told just to follow this. And to support behavioral activation, Levinson back in 1972, he developed this pleasant event schedule, which is a list of 320 pleasurable activities, which the patient could pick from and do on a daily or weekly basis. And as behavioral activation is this kind of very straightforward method, which is only centered around activity, it carries a lot of potential to embed it actually in mobile application. And with a mobile application, we could eliminate some of those previously mentioned accessibility issues, and actually provide a quality of care which can be scaled indefinite. So the main goal for our study here was to develop such a behavioral activation app. But as a unique feature with this app was to include recommendations which could introduce novel activities that are personalized to the individual user, just like mimicking the role of the therapist when they suggest activities together. So our approach started with bi-weekly meetings with our interdisciplinary team of clinicians mostly, and us from the more engineering part, and SGI designers, and we set up workshops with patients. And in this presentation, I would like to emphasize one outcome from this kind of workshop, which involved actually the UX design of the recommender part, the system. So the patient raised 2 concerns. So first, they are aware, they're conscious about their clinical disorder, but they are not fond of tools, digital life tools that stigmatize their or somewhat display their special needs. And in this case, with an app that actually literally tells them what to do, it is unfortunately the case. Secondly, they expressed a strong concern of the types of feeling that could be induced if they were unable to commit or engage in whatever kind of recommendation that the app was giving them. And this could potentially have a harmful effect, of course. With this in mind, we developed the app. I show you here some simple screenshots from it. First, in the first screenshot, we see the main overview that the patient is seeing, which includes their planned activities divided in morning, afternoon, and evening. And with this plus sign, they can go in and actively pick a recommendation that is given to them. So when they press that, they can say, okay, give me any recommendation, and we list top 10. They could also just go in and browse the this catalog that is the same as Levinson, but we have added more activities that are more in line with this more digital lifestyle we have now in the 2020s and back in the 72s, such as, for instance, writing a positive commentary to an internet article. So with this, with the app, we ran a feasibility study. It was an 8-week-long feasibility study with 17 patients diagnosed with an affective disorder. So as we recruited from both the clinic and from a national recruitment webpage, we got a really good heterogeneous, like a really good mixed group of people, both young and older adults, up to 56. Also from almost none to severe depressive symptoms at study onset. And so for the next slides here, I will show you what kind of results we got from the interviews. First of all, as this was a like in the wild study, which is very uncontrolled, we were thrilled actually to hear experience from the patient that they had a positive influence on the fact of planning activities. I will, as this is our core behavioral activation value, you could say. So let me read one of the quotes here. It is more likely that you get activated if you have a planned activity. When you wake up and you have nothing to do, it can make you feel bad. But when you wake up and you already have a plan, it is really nice. So the fact that they had this kind of activities visually organized before them in the app was an incentive for them, or a nudge, as they explained, to initiate the activity. Another strong result of the app usage was the ability to provide inspirations, like MOOPS's ability to provide inspiration. The fact of displaying concrete activities, precise activities in a catalog is very helpful. And let me read one of these quotes. I used to wake up and watch TV series. It helped me to go out, be more social. It planned it more. I learned to knit and I want to learn to swim in the winter. I did not think about adding these kind of hobbies to my life before, but now I do. So as you can see a bit with this quote is that the problem is usually that, which is also explained in the interview, is when their decision making, basically their ideation is impaired when they are in these bad days. So they tend to go to more passive activities, such as reaching out for the remote control and turning on the TV when nothing is planned. But when engaged in pleasurable activities, they will initiate a positive loop because they become aware of the performed activity, telling themselves, yeah, hey, I actually did something. And that is also another result that I bring up here now, is the activity awareness when engaged in activities, which is a fundamental outcome of behavior activation. So what we learned from furthermore from the interviews of awareness is that they actually it was also triggered simply by browsing the list of pleasurable activity, our catalog. Let me read one quote here. Every morning I take a shower, put on perfume, I put cream on my face, and that is never something I think about. I've learned to appreciate this. So in that sense, it had a really positive outcome for these patients. Last result I want to mention is the recommendation part. So when we observed how it was used and what kind of activities was used, we quickly saw that the feature was used very little. When we dig deeper in the interview to find out why, we understood that it was mostly like easy and less time-wise activities that were picked. It was something they wanted to do in the moment, like here and now. Usually they were sitting like in the couch or in the bed and they took up their phone and they look at the recommendations. And this kind of scenario is unfortunately not effective for behavior activation. So for recommendations to be effective, they basically need to be designed as part of the planning phase. It should be something scheduled for them. It's precisely like the therapist recommends the patient to schedule specific activities for the upcoming week. So in conclusion, we learned that the personalized recommendation in its current design was not the important factor for the success of MOOCs here. It was the inspiration of concrete, specific activities and the scheduling or planning of these activities.
Perfect.
Thank you, Darius. Let's give a round of applause. Great. And I can see we already have some questions in the chat. So let's start with the question from Anna.
Yeah, so thank you for the talk. I was wondering, is this instead of a therapist or is it instead of nothing? Because it seems like the accountability that you have towards your therapist and carrying out these activities would be much higher than towards an app where no one reacts if you don't do what it recommends.
Precisely. This is actually the design of this was to be used without the therapist for yourself in those moments where you are by yourself, basically.
But instead of a therapist, so it wouldn't.
Not instead, but in the times where they are not in contact with a therapist. So they are of course very highly important that they have therapist contact all the time. But this is a tool that could help, particularly those that have a harder time getting in contact with therapists or in a transition moment, basically from, we have a case in Denmark where a lot of younger kids, when they are associated with this youth psychology department, and then they are transferred to the adult psychology, and in that transition moment, there is a lot of lack of support, and this could be a good case for those moments.
And we have a question from Frode.
Yes. Hi, Darius. Thank
Hey,
you for
Frode.
that talk. It's really nice.
Yeah.
I was wondering, did you look at any effects when you did the feasibility study, or only the qualitative? And also, I would like to talk about the further plans for what you're planning to do, and maybe a bit more about the implementation, if you have time.
Good question. So yeah, we looked at we're actually doing now. So the Kai paper is very much alike with the qualitative results, understanding why for instance the recommended part didn't work. But yeah, we are looking now. There's in another paper, and we're looking, for instance, on the PHQ, which is this depression changes, because they're doing that every second week in these 8 weeks. And there's a global clinical effect for the participants. And we also, in that paper, seeing why some patients benefited more than others. So there's, of course, a small fraction that did not change, that did not improve during the course. So yeah, we have looked at that, and it looks really good on the big group scale. And of course, then we're checking individually why these changes are seen. Yeah, and then there was I don't know if that answered the question, but the other question about our future steps, right? So we are in contact with a clinic in Roskilde, I believe it was. Jacob is the main responsible for that, and we're trying to make this app available, but in a more well-being kind of not meant for depression, but more of a well-being app that will also help people with diabetes, for instance, in their daily life. So we are trying to redesign it to a more common group, even for someone like us to have this kind of more organized day. Yeah.
Thank you. Please, we still have 4 minutes for questions, so please drop some more questions if you have. Otherwise, I have a question. So I was a bit curious about these activities that are suggested. It seems that they are personalized and that there is some sort of like personalization going on. I'm curious if you could tell a bit more about how these activities become tailored to the individual.
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't have that much time for presenting that part, but I'm really excited for that part. Yeah. So basically, we used a simple naive Bayes method, which is a statistical method that counts occurrences. So when the patient is typing in, for instance, went for a run on a Sunday, we store this information. We store the time label. So on a Sunday, they were doing a physical activity and they were writing. We split basically the sentence into words. So something with run, something with lake. And then we use this information to see, based on our 382 activities we have in the database, we see which one matches best for that person with those texts, and at Sundays, for instance, at mornings. So if you tend to walk a lot every evening, for instance, then if you want a recommendation in the evening, that type of activity will have higher probability and it will come up as a suggestion. If that answers, yeah.
Okay. So the idea is that it's like slowly learns about things that you already
Precisely.
done, and then it suggests you more of the same things that you already have done.
Precisely.
Okay.
Well, but the things it suggests are novel in the case of usually it's not something they've done before, or it's slightly different. For instance, we have one that says, if you, for instance, take a walk, you write you're walking a turn. We have an activity in the database that says try to take a 5 minutes walk in the neighborhood to look at the architecture of the nearby buildings. So in that sense, it inspires more novel things.
Okay, because one of the things that I saw on the slides on the 72 version was something like look at the skies drifting or something like that, and I thought, wow, that is so poetic. That's beautiful.
Yeah, but and it has a lot of different types of activities. We had somebody who said like a majority of those were not really aligned with me, but I found some that were. So yeah, it's quite different.
Just at last, can you say something about the social element of this app and the kind of like relationship? It's like, I guess there's both a relationship between if you have a psychiatrist and like, does it become part of the relation with the psychiatrist, or does it become more like a kind of relationship between, for instance, loved ones or friends or family members?
That's a good question. So when I talked with these patients, they were mostly it was much on an individual kind of. They said they got a little bit of a relationship with the app, as you could say, not with a therapist or not with family members. They were like one for instance told me like, whoa. So I've been a lot of social. I'm trying to be a lot social, right? But then this app tells me that I should be a bit alone. I was like, okay, this app is telling me that I should maybe be alone. That's good for me. It seems like I should try that. So it becomes like some kind of connection with the app. And we also have these kind of notifications every morning that says a bit. It gives a resume, like a recap of the previous day, and they also mentioned that was quite nice to have this kind of. I think she mentioned a buddy with me that could tell me some positive things. So yeah, it's a relation in that sense.
Great, thank you so much. Let's give another round of applause. And the next paper in the session is by Sarah Homewood and co-authors. And Sarah will present designers in white coats deploying Ovum, a fertility tracking device.
Thank you. And I had some technical issues earlier, so this might take a little bit longer. Hopefully not.
Yes.
So the annotations, take off the annotations thing.
So that's being turned off for the whole of the meeting. So
fantastic.
That's all in order.
Oh no. I have to install.
I see a screen now.
Ovum is a saliva tracking device that is the result of a critique of current methods of fertility tracking. From our critique, we found that existing commercial devices provided an individual, a clinical, and an expert experience. And we wanted to kind of challenge that. So rather than being designed for an individual experience in that it was marketed to the individual who would be getting pregnant and they would only be the only ones expected to be using the device. We wanted to design instead for a shared experience of fertility tracking, because predominantly this is a shared act of sexual intercourse leading to conception. Rather than a clinical experience in the kind of form and aesthetics of the device and the experience, we wanted to perhaps see what would happen if we offered a domestic experience, so one that was more fitted to the home environment that the tracking would be taking place within. And rather than it being an expert experience, where the device would be the expert in dictating whether the user was fertile or not, we wanted to see what would happen if we offered a DIY, kind of do-it-yourself experience of fertility tracking. And we actually found that the method of saliva tracking kind of offered was a kind of a riper design space for exploring those qualities. So typically saliva tracking devices are in the form of mini microscopes, or actually just microscopes. And this diagram shows how saliva samples, dried saliva samples, changes over the menstrual cycle. So you can see that from day 9 to 14 would be when the user was fertile. So you can start to see some kind of crystals creeping in on the 9th and the 10th days, and then increasing up to the 13th day. And that's when ovulation would be taking place. So rather than peering into a microscope alone, Ovum actually uses a really strong LED to project a silhouette of the saliva sample out into the user's bedroom. So the user puts a drop of saliva onto the device, waits for it to dry, puts the lid back onto the main body, turns it, and then the projection comes out the device. And it can be up to about 2 meters. So it's quite an impact, it gives quite an impact on the room. So we kind of aim to make this a shared and beautiful experience of fertility tracking. And to kind of avoid this clinical aesthetic, we actually employed a ceramicist to create these handmade bowls that the electronic components and 3D parts could fit into. So in order to explore kind of what these oppositional experiential qualities kind of did for users, we actually deployed the device. And because we knew that we were going to deploy Ovum, we thought about the packaging. We wanted the device to be a research product. So for our participants to react to the device, we made sure that they hadn't been attempting to conceive for more than 10 months. And this was partly because there could have been underlying fertility issues there. If they'd been attempting to conceive for longer than that, no, not necessarily. And also because perhaps this would have been a more emotional process for them. And in order to kind of gain their informed consent, we actually gave these participants a lot of information about saliva tracking before they started, so they'd be able to understand a little bit more about the method before they agreed to the study, including the fact that the FDA, there are FDA approved devices, but there's some discussion about whether it's completely 100% effective, and also scientific studies that have shown it to be very effective. So we kind of present our findings in terms of the 3 experiential qualities that we were designing with. So in terms of the domestic design, which was where we designed the device to be more suited to the home than to the clinic, some of our findings included that at the beginning of this deployment, our participants loved the kind of design and the aesthetics of the device. And one thing that was great about it for them was that they could have it out in the room and people wouldn't necessarily recognize that it was a fertility tracking device. But after a while, the descriptions of the device as sculptural and very chic and Scandinavian kind of wore off. And they actually wanted the device to be more practical, to be smaller, to be lighter, not to be made of ceramic. So they would worry about dropping it on the bathroom floor. So one of them described, the honeymoon phase is over. Another factor was that the design of the device at the beginning was said to kind of alleviate the stress of the experience of fertility tracking. So it was a soft science project. But actually, once we probed what this participant actually meant by this, kind of revealed that because she was also using other tracking methods at the same time, that there wasn't this kind of stress on this method particularly. and the fact that it was a novel thing for her, and she thought maybe that was more why she thought it was a kind of a less stressful experience. But it was an interesting statement to start off with. In terms of the shared experiential qualities we designed for, the reasons why this kind of the use of OVUM became a collaborative act, or the reason why our participants shared the experience of using OVUM, was either because they loved the projection of the crystals, like it's a very kind of powerful image, and so they wanted to share it with their partners, so they called their partners in to look at this image. Another reason was that OVUM gave, as I'll come to, that it gave very ambiguous results. So their insecurity prompted them to ask their partner to come in to kind of give a second opinion. And there were some other really interesting things about kind of the shared or gender roles or roles within fertility tracking that arose. And one thing was how a partner would kind of wish to have more of an involvement in the process. So he deliberately set alarms on his phone, or deliberately became involved in the process as a kind of supportive act. Another one was how the experience of using OVUM and our discussions around their roles prompted particularly one participant to kind of regret that she hadn't involved her partner earlier. She said, like, I just thought it was my responsibility, but it isn't. There were kind of the reasons why our participants didn't share the experience of using OVUM were kind of quite mundane in that their schedules were just different. You know, one would wake up before the other. We recommended that the participants use OVUM first thing in the morning, just because it needs to be an hour before you've eaten, or you should use OVUM an hour after you've eaten or brushed your teeth. So it's kind of simpler that way, and a recommended thing for the saliva tracking methods in general. But yeah, their schedules were just out of sync. So one of them would get up, and then the other one would get up half an hour later. So they weren't present to do the tracking process them together. Another reason was that it just never occurred to the partner who's going to get pregnant to share it with their partner. If it was their body that they were tracking, they couldn't see a reason to involve their partner in it. And one of them, P2, like, she described how she felt as if, because her partner was eating healthily and exercising, that he was doing his role. So her role was to do the tracking. In terms of the do-it-yourself, DIY experiential quality, we found a lot of initial optimism about the method itself, that it was easy, clear, and user-friendly, the method of seeing crystals and that dictating fertility. But then after a while, like during the 3-month deployment, we saw quite a few instances where OVUM didn't give the results that they'd expected. It did for some of them, but not all the time, not every menstrual cycle. And one reaction to this was to critique the leaflet that we provided them as being kind of too narrow. So they found their results to be outside of what was shown in the leaflet. And this actually meant that they turned those results kind of against themselves, and they then started to worry about their own menstrual health and their own fertility. So they were asking us a lot of questions about kind of, is it because there's something wrong with me? What does it mean? Which of course we couldn't answer as designers. And it was interesting, kind of some of them went to the gynecologist during the study, and OVUM was kind of evaluated as being correct or incorrect by these gynecologists. But despite the kind of erratic results that OVUM showed over this time, like 3 of the participants, the one who'd kind of reached the end of the study, the other ones, one of them got pregnant and there were 2 dropouts, they actually asked us to keep the device. And the reason was that they felt as if 3 menstrual cycles was not long enough to test whether this device was accurate. They felt as if their bodies changed so much from menstrual cycle to menstrual cycle that it could have been that was the reason that was causing the erratic results. So in the paper, we kind of expand quite a lot on the fact that OVUM, that as designers, we kind of had to deal with the fact that OVUM gave erratic results. OVUM was kind of designed, or we used the saliva tracking method based on trust in the multiple scientific reports on the method and the fact that there are FDA approved devices on the market. But I guess what we found kind of with our study was that the long-term deployments of these devices give different results to scientific trials. So that was a really interesting finding, actually, and perhaps one that could kind of point to some kind of more collaborative work between the scientific domains and designers. Also, the fact that participants could not separate the clinical kind of, the fact that they felt as if they were in a clinical trial of the saliva tracking method from the design of OVUM itself. So all of their thoughts and reactions and all of our conversations were very much centered around the saliva tracking method, rather than us being able to separate those two things out. So it kind of, our research just highlights how married these two aspects of are in self-tracking, the method and the design of the device. And perhaps our findings or our criticism, the criticism of our participants that the design of the leaflet was too narrow, or that, you know, the fact that their results didn't fit what we'd shown them, points to the fact that we should have been more open, even though this was a research product. We should have been more open in that leaflet about the fact that their results might deviate from that. And this actually led to them turning this ambiguity led to them turning to us as experts, whereas our intention had been to kind of make them feel like experts in reading their own bodies. Another thing was kind of our emotional experience of this study was kind of a little bit tumultuous, because it was challenging being treated as if we were kind of, you know, experts in fertility. And I kind of been thinking about this, reflecting on it, and as interaction designers, we led to kind of develop a heightened ability to listen for, like, and understand our participants' emotional experiences. Like, we weren't only designing for the body and for kind of effective and accurate tools, but we were also designing for the experience of fertility tracking. We were also, we were designing for a person with emotions, relationships, and a specific context instead. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Great, that was a lovely presentation. So once again, please write your questions in the chat. And I will go ahead with the first question while people ask. So I'm curious about these experiential qualities that you have been designing with, because it seems that their qualities, they come from somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems that with this study, you're trying to evaluate a bit of if they come through. Mm-hmm. So first question is, why these qualities? Why are they interesting to you? And did you see any other qualities sort of like arise through the deployment?
I mean, so the qualities come out of the critique of existing fertility tracking methods, like I showed on the first slide. We talk a little bit more about that in a pictorial, disc pictorial that we had from last year. So it came out of the critique of, and we actually did kind of interaction criticisms of urine tracking devices, temperature tracking devices, and these saliva tracking devices, but understand what kind of experience the design of these devices offered participants, and then thinking about, okay, well, if they offer this, then what else can we give them? And what are the limitations of these devices? And taking quite a broad kind of approach to them. So looking at the packaging, or as part of interaction criticisms, to look at the packaging, like who was the target user and how was that communicated? For example, for the individual experiential quality. So all of these devices were targeted to one person. So we were thinking about, well, actually conception in most cases, not always, but in most cases involves two people, and it's a very emotional and kind of complex experience. So what would happen if you kind of designed for two people as part of the experience rather than one, for example? In terms of other qualities that came out, do you mean in the design process?
I meant when people were actually using it throughout the 3 months. Mm-hmm. If they saw some other qualities, because often like we try to design these qualities into our products, but we cannot really control what kind of qualities actually arise with people, right?
Yeah, that was the really interesting thing. I would say that to see the qualities be there at the beginning for them and be like, oh, I really appreciate the design of it, and the fact that, like, oh, it's really fun to show my partner when the crystals start showing, and all this kind of thing. But then that fading away over the 3 months, like that's the biggest or the most interesting thing for me, and something I want to carry on exploring, like this kind of the fact that self-tracking devices, apparently, based on my study, you know, there's a kind of a sell-by date for them, that they're worth as kind of maybe designly objects or more experience, or if you're, yeah, their worth as experiential kind of objects that facilitate a particular experience go down over time. And in the end, like people kind of, I think I say it in the paper, like that, you know, they didn't want an experience, they wanted a tool. Like this was the most important thing for them.
Mm-hmm. I thought that was really fascinating. Please ask your questions, people. So that was one of the interesting things. I thought the quote that said something about the honeymoon. The honeymoon is over now. Now I just want the object to be what it's supposed to be. And so I was curious, these experiential qualities, like if you see that they're important to have there from the start, if you can say anything about that, like do we then need to design for this first phase and then have something taking over in the next phase, or?
Yeah, I mean, that could be one way. I mean, if you think about, so Ovum's actually, I'm going through a commercialization process now. So like it could be, you know, Ovum could become a commercial product. And that's a really interesting thing now, because the business development people I'm working with, they talk about Ovum as an entertainment device. So like it's completely different from if it was a microscope. So then, and then it becomes a marketing strategy, or it becomes a way to sell the device initially. And then, you know, who cares about the later, that's their perspective, right? Like the later things you find out about like what people actually want over time don't matter if it's a commercial product. So that's been a super interesting process, actually.
Thank you. We have a question from Nadia.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really nice. I think my question was kind of already what Louise was actually just speaking about, how like I find it so interesting that, you know, they had these certain, the real participants had these certain expectations of it being sort of an accurate medical device, right? But and your intention kind of was to have it like, have them kind of be empowered to do these medical things at home, right? And do it in a domestic setting. But there was kind of some sort of interesting tension there. I don't know if, I don't know if there was, I was wondering if there was like more a way to kind of do it slowly, kind of like maybe ease from the medical to the domestic somehow. I don't know if you could just comment about that. Or.
Yeah, so maybe keeping the design closer. For example, the fact that it was kind of a lot bigger than the mini microscopes and ceramic, like those were maybe steps too far in the road to domestic, like on the spectrum between medical and domestic. Yeah, I see what you mean. Like perhaps it could have been closer to the medical or the original kind of useful aesthetic. Yeah, I can see I'm out of time.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. That was really great. So actually, let's give Sarah first an applause again. Yay. And her co-author, Anna, of course, who's also here. Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this session. That was wonderful to have you with us. So we're going to start a new session in 15 minutes. If you stay here, you can hear about learning and games. Otherwise, you can hear about sensing or about design too. So thank you for coming.